Stephen and Adrian and I have agreed to stay in for a period of time here to allow you to ask questions if you might have them. And so I'm going to open up Q&A over on the right. You'll see a Q&A window that will open up over on your right. If you have questions there, feel free to chat in particular questions that you might have that you want to ask with regard to elements that were presented in today's workshop. We're really interested in you thinking through the ways in which your particular project might interface with some of these elements that we presented. So don't hesitate to chat in there questions that you have. You can chat them in right there at the bottom right hand of the screen. Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate your advice you gave us in planning for the workshop. Stephen, TNT Productions asking about privacy and security issues. Did you have additional comments about that?
So I tried to talk about it a little bit in my presentation, but the main thing that I did want to highlight overall again is getting a sense of where your media lives. And so anything that is going to live even for a short period of time on a cloud-based server that is provided by a third-party supplier is a potential security concern, for sure. So the more local you can keep things when you're using technology, the better. Obviously, the very best way to do a very sensitive interview is just to have it one-on-one in the room, and then using, again, like anonymity, putting major restrictions on it as far as the archival use of it. And in some cases, like in the past, we've had to investigate ways to encrypt data that was recorded in this environment as individuals are traveling across the world. So there are some services out there that basically create hidden partitions on hard drives, whether it's on a flash drive or an SD card or whatnot, that only you can access with your code to do things like that. So there are a lot of different options out there to help you secure your interviews. But in general, when you're thinking about recording remotely, that is certainly something that you have to think about, is where that data is actually living and actually being created when you're doing a remote interview.
Great, thanks, Stephen. The building rapport with the narrator that you've only met remotely, that pre-interview process may not be one conversation, but maybe a process of conversations to build relationship there, I think would be really essential in doing that. I think taking time to explain the purposes of your project, taking time to explain the significance of their participation in your project, what you feel like they could contribute to your project that would be significant. I think those are key things in building rapport with our narrators. The question about privacy of recordings uploaded to the cloud Zoom, that is an issue. One thing I would look for, one metric that I've looked at to consider, especially if you're really concerned about privacy concerns, is some video conferencing platforms are HIPAA compliant here in the United States, and that would be something I would look at, because if you're particularly concerned about privacy, I would look for a platform that is HIPAA compliant, and Zoom right now is not HIPAA compliant, and so you've got to think about that if you're going distance. Ideas on making your subject comfortable with technology. Stephen, do you have an idea about the most user-friendly formats that you would recommend?
Sure. I think a lot of this is going to depend, you have to go where they live, basically. So you need to ask them what they typically use, how they typically communicate, and maybe just directly, what sort of technology do you have in the house? And then go from there. And so there are some people who might be much more comfortable with just staying on their cell phone. And so you might want to either consider a cell phone app on your end or a recording app in general if you have a landline and go that route. You have to figure out their comfort level with video as well. A lot of us are getting thrust into this video conferencing world, and so many of us self-identify as introverts, and we're a little scared about that, particularly if you started a project already and you have a situation where they thought it was going to be an audio interview and suddenly you're using a video platform, and what does this mean? Are you going to be plastering? Do you have to get all dressed up, And so it might be very important to have those conversations before and say, okay, I really want us to be able to look at each other in the interview so that we can have that rapport, but I'm only going to be archiving the audio from this interview. And that might ease them greatly. And now you have to make sure that you're fulfilling all those promises. Again, that video doesn't get out into the preservation process. So I think a lot of it is just going to depend on their own experience and their own comfort level. And so I think you're going to want to start with that questionnaire, so to speak, and go from there.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that's useful also for Catherine's questions about supplying interviews with equipment and making them learn to use it. Kelly Krager, who was in here earlier, who left, this is why he does exclusively phone interviews, because it's technology that they are familiar with, it's technology that they've used, and so you may want to think through that as you think through both your narrator set and your project aims. A couple of folks asked me to clarify what I meant by markers earlier. These are things I look for in an interview itself that I think there's more information behind that I need to explore in the interview. So sometimes it's a self-evaluative statement. Someone may say, that's not what I always expected it to be. I think that's indicating to me that there's more information there that I need to explore and gather more information on. They may correct themselves in the interview where they say one thing and then they change that and say another thing. I'm going to wonder if they're self-censoring or there's other things at work going on. Markers are just these moments that come up with an interview that sometimes, if we're not really attuned and listening actively, can pass by us. If we are paying attention, there may be something that we want to grab onto and explain a little bit more. Tina's raised questions, Stephen, about using Google Docs for transferring or saving a copy of the interview. I think this is about security, different cloud-based services.
Sure. I think that would fall under the same category as the actual interview recordings being natively placed on a cloud server as well. So if you're using like a Google Drive or a Box or a Dropbox, just keep in mind that that information lives somewhere else. And in some cases, it lives on multiple servers. Like we use Box at Baylor for our institutional cloud-based service. And it's continuously like bounced around several different servers as far as where this data lives, which is great for backups, but it can also cause some security concerns. So again, if the more concerned you are about security, the more low-tech you need to go. So if it means doing an in-person interview with an audio recorder on an SD card and then actually physically delivering that card or backing it up to certain media that either you yourself own or the archive itself owns, and only going with that, that's probably the way to go. The more concern you have about it, the more you want to just keep it to the people who are actually participating in the project and not putting it out into platforms and areas that you're not exactly sure. Like I don't even know where all the Box servers are, in the United States. I know they exist out there, and it's great for our workflow. But you have to be considerate for that special security. And just in the old days, is how we used to lock things up in the cabinet, the physical cabinet. We're kind of doing that as well by keeping it in our digital cabinet, only on our computer, only on computers that are used in your archival institution.
Thank you, Stephen. Zoom does not record in WAV. You can, it's recording in a video file, not an audio file. But as Stephen was saying earlier, you can make an audio file from it, but it's not going to produce that WAV recording for you that you definitely want. Thanks for clarifying HIPAA earlier. This is what health professionals use in the United States. So that they're concerned about those privacy issues with regard to platforms, and that's what I meant when I said HIPAA compliant earlier. So thanks for spelling out the acronym for me. Catherine, the question about someone had asked about release form fatigue. Mary was asking about release form fatigue. If you're interviewing individuals and you have one deed of gift signed, it can cover a series of interviews. So you just need to get that signed gift once, and then you're good for the series of interviews. Michelle's asking advice about transcription of recordings obtained remotely. This is slipping into a transcription conversation, which is a much larger conversation, but there are tools that have been mentioned throughout with regard to voice recognition transcription, and there's also manual transcription. So that might be a good interview thing to follow up with us if you want to, and we can talk about your specific situation that you might be dealing with.
And Stephen, I'll make a quick
Sure.
plug again for that technology website that was part of my presentation. So I have an entire section on there just on transcription. So you can check those links out and read the article as well to see what we've used in the past and where we're going right now, which is pretty exciting with all the automated transcription options out there and how you're supposed to consider those and error rates and how you can drop that into your workflow.
Stephen, Karen has also asked about how would you do a setup? Just how would you do really a setup with a interviewer and an interviewee? I think she's talking about audio recording, if you saw that question.
I don't see it directly here yet, but is that for in-person or remote? Or are we talking about remote setup?
It's recorded remotely. How you connect a recorder to your phone to get good quality of the person on the other end who's speaking on the phone as well.
Okay. So as I mentioned before, really that JK audio line, and they've got several different versions now based on if you're using landline, cell phone, Bluetooth. You want something to kind of process the audio streams for you and then dump it into a device that's going to record it for you. So the setup that we have right now in our offices is we have a Zoom H5, and we have the XY microphone attachment on the top of it that has the input jack, and we put the input jack into that Zoom H5 from the JK audio device, and then the JK audio device is connected to both the telephone and the headset. And so that audio is streamed into that audio recorder, and then the audio recorder captures that and records it in the WAV format that I spoke of earlier. So you're going to have a setup sort of like that if you're wanting to use direct connections to the audio and then use professional equipment in order to capture it.
Adrian, Valerie has asked a question. Where do special considerations, restrictions on use, for example, go on the consent form? Do you add an addendum or create a separate sheet where they can check the boxes they need? What would be the best way to include considerations?
Hi, Valerie. Okay, unfortunately, due to the amount of time that we had, that was something that I did not include. However, what we normally do, there is a space where that restriction is added. So basically, after the main language of your legal release form, you would add a language saying with only the following restrictions, and then you usually leave some space to write in what those agreed upon restrictions are. Now, what we have at the Institute, we have two different forms. So we have our regular release form and then a restricted release form. And sometimes the question comes about of how do I know which one to use or which one do I present first? And I will say that you can usually gauge that from your pre-interview conversation, especially if you know that you're going to be talking about topics that may be sensitive or controversial or may be certain things that the interviewee may not want out at that certain time. Again, that example with someone who may be working for a particular company and they're still an employee there, you may want to go restrict it that way. But also, even after you conduct the interview, while you're reviewing or your narrator is reviewing the transcript or the audio, there may be some concern that pops up at that point as well, to where the person may want to be like, hey, is there a possibility we could do sort of restriction? Or again, it may be an administrative decision where you're reviewing it and you're like, I think that we may need to restrict this interview. So you do have your normal form. So the restriction just goes right below what your regular language is for your legal agreement, and then you just enter what those restrictions are.
Thanks, Adrian. Steve and Alicia, if you'll scroll to kind of the end of the Q&A, how do we maximize sound recordings on phone interviews? She gives an idea of a setup they're using there. I don't know if you have advice on that you would give her.
Okay, I'm trying to find it. Okay, Alicia. Okay, how do we maximize sound recording on phone interviews you're using H4? Do we monitor gain levels to ensure that we're not over recording? Phones in airplane mode for this to both sides. Okay, so what I typically do before anyone uses our telephone recording setup at the office is I will check the level first. So when and you can do this yourself actually, so you can pick up on your end and call someone else in the office and look on the level readout. I'm trying to visualize H4n. I think it has the level readout like H5 does, and actually see what your levels are doing in that conversation before you even start recording. So I would make sure it's almost like you're recording in the room and you're testing your levels before you start your recording to make sure you're kind of in that -6, -12 range with the peaks. So if you're in an office environment, it's pretty easy because you can just call somebody else. But if you're remotely or whatnot, you might just want to pick a friend and try it out and see how those levels react for you on the digital readout on the device before you actually begin interviewing.
Thanks, Stephen. Linda's asked a question to Adrian about capturing language concerning heirs' rights to the interviewees in release form. What do we have specifically on that in the release?
In regards to heirs' rights, let me think. Well, I know what we do is we get the interviewee. Are you speaking in terms of the interviewee has passed, or in the case that they do pass, what their rights are? Because typically what we do from the offset of getting that copyright is to make sure that we obtain the rights of the interviews for the project. If you could type that in for me so I can check for you.
Yeah, we'll see if she types in a clarification there.
Okay.
Elizabeth asked, for lack of a better word, is there a statute of limitations or a window for which, how long after the fact, interviewees can institute new restrictions on access beyond those specifically stated in the release form?
I would say if there is something that comes about that it makes the interviewee uncomfortable or something that they don't want out there, we try our best. We do our best to honor that. For example, let's say that the interviewee sees their interview on YouTube and that makes them uncomfortable. So that would be a conversation that we have with the interviewee. And if we're able to make those adjustments and put that in place, we will. That's part of the narrator rights. Again, if you remember earlier, like let's say that they want to withdraw from the project, they have the right to do that at any time. And that's from the inception to the project to past the completion of the project. So if there are concerns that they have, we will address those and work with them to make sure that those restrictions that they're requesting or whatever needs they are needing to be met, that we do that for our narrators.
Okay, Valerie's clarified down at the end there. Adrian, if you want to take a look at that. Stephen, a couple of folks have asked about if they're recording. Several folks have mentioned the method of recording from a speakerphone to a device. Are there recommendations for reducing interference when you're doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was talking about before with cell phones and other electronic equipment, speakers sometimes are notorious for doing that with other electronic equipment. So you certainly don't want to place your recorder too close to the actual speaker that you're going to be recording. But you're going to do basically the same thing that I talked about earlier with the cell phone recording in checking your levels. And so I think you want to do a test beforehand and see just what volume setting is great to get a full volume at the level that you want from the interviewee's perspective, while keeping your recorder a comfortable distance away from your speaker. Most of our speakers are either going to be attached to the monitor or right next to our monitor. So you want to keep it away from that, obviously, loud enough to where it registers. There's going to be a Goldilocks spot here. Loud enough that it registers, loud enough that it's in the range you want, -6, -12 decibels, and then also not going to be interfered with by either that speaker or other equipment that might be on your desk or nearby as well. So it's going to just take a little getting used to, of course, but that's why we test our equipment even in the field as well. So that's just going to be part of the new procedures for us when we're considering remote interviews.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Several questions were asked about processing the recording or processing the recording itself or processing the recording into a transcript. That may be a little bit beyond the scope of what we can kind of cover today, just because of the things we're doing in the room right now. Those are things you can reach out to us individually. And again, I'll supply emails, Adrian's email, my email, Stephen's email. We encourage you to follow up with us if you have particular questions that you want to ask regarding some of the content we covered or some of the things we couldn't get to in just the 2-hour webinar. Let me look through and see if we've got some burning questions on the right-hand side. I'm sorry, just from the volume here, we're not going to be able to answer all of them.
Okay,
Sarah, you ask. Go ahead.
I was going to address Valerie's question while you were searching through there. Is that okay?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, Valerie, so you were asking if the narrator chooses to release information at the beginning of the interview and then concludes the interview and has changed his or her mind. Again, the narrator, it's the right that they have to withdraw from the project at any time. What I would do in that sense is have a conversation with the narrator and just ask, okay, what are the specific reasons, or what was the specific language? Because it could be like a short snippet or something that was said that she or she does not want included in the interview, and with that we can work with redactions or restrictions or certain things of that nature to alleviate that. But if it's something to where the interviewee or the narrator feels like just uncomfortable with the project at the end, then in that case they have the right to withdraw that that interview from participation in the project.
Thank you, Adrian. Barb, you asked about connecting to JK Audio. That tap, you could either use an XLR connection. I know on some of the Marantz voice recorders, the cell phone recorder has an aux cord connection that you can use. Rachel asked a question about release forms for family projects. I would still do a release form for a personal family project. I think those are important. They can be structured differently. That resource that Adrian pointed out, the Oral History and the Law, would give you a good idea of possible forms you could use, and we can recommend some forms to you. There's no need to reinvent the wheel here. There's examples out there that would be useful for you to use. All right, additional recordings down at the bottom. Best editing software to edit and burn the recordings. That's an interesting question. Stephen, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, I typed in an answer. I'm getting some things to my personal Q&A, and so I'm answering in text, but I'm not sure if everybody can see it, so I'll repeat it. So I said, in general, software that is shipped with your PC or Mac these days can actually accomplish this. For example, if you're on a Mac, iTunes will do this. All you have to do is like add the audio file. It can be just the base WAV file, the huge file, to your library, and then once it's in there, you can go through your menu options and just say burn this to a CD, and then you'll have other menus that come up from that. But it's pretty straightforward these days. In the early days of people making their own mixtapes on CDs, of course, you had to have special software and all that, but it's fairly ubiquitous in the things that come with your computer nowadays.
Thanks, Stephen. Nicholas has asked for some specific equipment and setup recommendations. There were several of those in Stephen's section, so it may be good to go back and review that recording on that slideshow for those recommendations there. If after seeing that you've still got some particular questions of the ways in which these could best suit your project, I wouldn't hesitate for you to email Stephen to get a recommendation. He's also offered an online link that has some great recommendations and practices to follow in picking out equipment as well. I think our Q&A is winding down a little bit, and so Lucille's actually asked a question. Adrian, you could answer this one. How would we handle narrator corrections or deletions from the recording? What might that look like?
Okay, with corrections or redactions from the recording or from the transcript, I'm sorry, there's something that popped up. What we would do, having that conversation with the narrator, is asking, okay, what portion or what things are they wanting to edit or redact? Because again, we have that process of where the narrator can review their transcript and the audio and make corrections. So we allow for those corrections to be done regardless. Now, if there's something that they're wanting to have taken out, what we do is we do that portion of the transcript, and please correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but there will be some sort of notice of, there will be that kind of missing information, if you will say. So like if we edit or redact a portion or anything from the transcript, there will be a notice of that there is not a match with the audio, or that the narrator has chosen to have some things edited in their transcript. There will be a note of that. And again, anytime that you redact any sort of information, whether it be from an audio file or from a transcript, there is going to be that noticeable difference. So we do explain that process to them as well. And if they decide that, yes, they want to go ahead and have this information edited or redacted, we do honor that, and we do take that out with editing software and with the transcript. And guys, if y'all want to add anything to that, please feel free to.
Yeah, that was a good summation, Adrian. So in general, with our transcripts, we have two places this shows up. In the front matter, we have a just general statement talking about how, because of speech is different than text, in general, the transcript is never going to line up exactly with the audio file. So we always have that as part of it. Now, if we get into specific redactions, however, we handle them differently based on the amount that was redacted or how many times things are redacted. So if it's just one or two little things, we'll have to remove it both from the audio file and the transcript, because we're making both of those available. And if they want it removed from the transcript, obviously they want it removed from the recording, and vice versa. If it gets to the point where there's way too much that needs to be redacted, that's when we start talking about restrictions rather than redactions. Because honestly, what we would rather have is as much information saved as possible for future researchers than just cut an interview to shreds. And so if they're more comfortable with saying, I want this to be known, but maybe in 5 to 10 years, or upon my death, or until I retire, or things like that. Then we start having those conversations. So this is a whole other field that we can discuss, obviously. But there are different ways that you can do this based on the amount generally that we're talking about.
Thank you, Stephen. Great questions. Great questions as you think about these to your how this applies to your particular projects. Again, I will follow up with an email on this. The recording will be made available as well from today's session. I do encourage you to reach out to us individually. I'm sorry, because of the number of folks we've got, we weren't able to go in depth into all the questions that have been asked, but I do appreciate y'all engaging us and asking us questions. It's been amazing to spend some time here with you. I'll speak for my colleagues. It's been amazing, particularly at this moment, as we're dealing with all the challenges that life is presenting us, and I do hope you're all well and safe as I say this. I'm glad you're endeavoring to continue to pursue your research. You're doing essential work that needs to be done, and so I'm glad you're looking at ways in which that can be done. I think in many ways this season may shift what we do as a methodology, and so it's interesting to be involved in the midst of a discussion about it. So thank you all for joining us. I'll close Q&A at this point. We'll stay on a minute, but we'll make the recording of the webinar and the recording of Q&A available to you via the OHA's website. I want to thank the Oral History Association again. I want to thank my colleagues Stephen Seeloff and Adrian Kane for their quick work in pulling this together. Thanks for attending.